Welcome to the Renegade Politics Podcast, where you'll understand politics from an expert perspective. On the web at renegadepoliticspodcast.com.
You know something, if you have a job where people don't question you in the job, then I think you're going to have a really poor adjustment to being a candidate for office. But if you have a job where you're constantly being questioned and challenged, then I think you might do okay. That's something that I just thought of after, of course, I did the outline. But it's such a perfect thing to consider as a first thing to consider, right? All these CEO guys that run and they don't do very well, you ever wonder why? That's why. Unless they're a realist. I don't want to drop any names here, especially when I'm going to tell you who I am. The reason for this podcast, of course, is because you're probably thinking of running for office or helping someone run for office. I don't want to dwell on who I am, not using my name, but it's not terribly hard to figure out who I am if you really are that passionate about it. I had a 20-year political campaign. I didn't have a 20-year political campaign. Feels like that sometimes. A 20-year political career that went on and off with other things that I did in my life. I've probably been involved in a couple dozen campaigns. I just, this last year, after doing some other things, won a campaign that I ran by less than 1%, which sort of got me to doing this. My first job was a communications director for a U.S. Senate candidate. As far as in politics, I worked on campaigns as small as school board, as large as media for a very large campaign, in different weird capacities we don't need to get into. I've been a candidate. I've been a radio talk show host. I've been a blog writer, a professional. Been a business owner. And that's enough about me. The reason for this podcast is that life is hard enough. Business is hard enough. People selling you things, wanting your money. And running for office is probably, in a way, don't take this the wrong way, it is probably the worst. As far as people taking advantage of your vulnerable state, your inexperience, and this happens at very high levels. It's the same as business, any business you'd be involved in, but I think it might be a little more intense because it's so personal. It's a personal thing when you run for office. So this podcast is intended to be a starting point. I mean, this particular episode, and I'll do my best to do more than that, but there really is very little information, I think, out there for mechanics. I'm going to try, again, my very best not to be partisan in this. This podcast is not intended to be partisan. I don't really care what your political background is. I just want to get information out there that is correct. There's enough misleading out there. So, okay, I'll wrap that up. That's fine. So why is this a Renegade podcast? What is Renegade all about? People might want to know. I think it's because if you think you should be elected, then you are one. A renegade. The dictionary says a person who behaves in a rebelliously unconventional manner is a renegade. And I think that this is what you have to do to win a campaign. Because those in power don't want you, don't need you, and couldn't care less about you. Unless you're one of the very, very few chosen ones, this is the case. And if you are, you're probably not listening to this podcast. A story I'll tell about, I don't know how long this was, 10 years ago, something like that. I had there was a guy I met, he was a state senator in a pretty large state. And he was telling me the story of how he got elected, and we were just talking about campaigns. And he says, yeah, I got a call from this guy, this local activist guy. I didn't know who the guy was, whatever. And he goes, yeah, show up, we want you to run for state senate. There's this parade, come down to the parade, and shake some hands, just come on down. Are you interested? He said, yes. He said he went down to, I guess he had some signs printed, I don't know. He says he went to the parade, and he said there were all these people, hundreds of people, with his signs. shaking his hand and waving at him, all excited about him running, that he'd never met. Now, that's probably not going to happen to you. And if it does, then you probably don't need to listen to this. Because again, this podcast ain't for you. While you are here, you're a candidate, you're a friend of a candidate, you're a member of the media, you're a political professional, you're curious, which is okay. What this podcast will eventually do, the first couple are going to be mechanical based, how to do this, how to do that, and eventually go into more advanced things. But I'm going to do, I am a Republican, but I will give you what you need to know no matter who you are. I don't sell products. I don't sell advice. I've lived this, and I've paid the price for many of the decisions I've made, good and bad. What is a campaign? You know, the word itself, campaign, is actually modeled after war. Gopak used to put out these training tapes that I thought were wonderful when I was in my 20s and in the 1990s. And they would say, if there's no controversy, there's no campaign. And that is such a significant statement. And it's worth actually thinking about and reflecting. That's the biggest problem with a challenger campaign. If you don't have a title, you're not elected, then you are a challenger campaign. If there is no controversy, there is no campaign. There's a difference between playing offense and defense. There's a difference between having something to lose and having nothing to lose. When you're a challenger, you have nothing to lose. You also sort of have everything to lose, I guess. But when you're elected, you've got to change positions. That was a big problem that the Speaker of the House had in the 1990s, Newt Gingrich, I think. He had a tough time changing from offense to defense. But that's one of those advanced topics you don't need to worry about. Hopefully you do later on. The first decision, of course, you have to make, and you're probably thinking about this now if you haven't already, and if you have made your decision, I think you should go through the steps to make it again. Should you run? And you probably have made up your mind if you're listening to this, and that's good, because you have to believe in yourself, or others will not. So congratulations on that. But there are things you have to be prepared to answer when others ask you, and you pretend you didn't make up your mind so quickly, right? Isn't that what you're doing? No? First, of course, people ask you, why you? Newspapers are going to ask this. You have to have an angle. There has to be a problem. There's you, there's the opponent. Can you take the heat personally? I've found in my life that lawyers have a problem because they like to see things fit in a box. They go through law school and they learn these rules. And, well, if it satisfies the rule, then, well, it must be a crime. What if the guy lies to you? Well, the facts don't say he lies, so it must be a crime. Well, see, that's the problem. You can take the bar exam and you can decide that the facts don't support the conclusion. But the problem in politics is you don't have the facts. You're winging it. You're taking the bar without any facts. You're making stuff up. That's politics. That's why I think lawyers struggle with it. Your past, something happened in your past, I'd say the first thing is it's never as bad as you think. And it's always worse than you realize at the same time, depending on who's asking. Your past should be something that's measured primarily, I think, on your comfortability. I'm going to inject a small story that I think is applicable, although it's not really completely the same. I knew a guy who was another state senator in another big state. And he was a Republican in an area, it was a blue-collar area. He's still elected, not to that position, though, as far as what I know, but not that you care. Of course you don't care. But he was pro-life. And people would ask, I'd say, well, you pro-life or pro-choice? I'm pro-life. Well, what about all these exceptions? I'm pro-life. No exceptions. I just don't think you should be killing babies. He'd say that. And guess what? That was it. And the guys that I saw in that same state get into trouble for that question are the guys that did this. well, personally, as a 52-year-old man, I'd never have an abortion, but yes, I support the decision if in mitigating circumstance. When you start doing that, it's that smelling blood thing. They smell blood, and they move in. You're better off playing dead. You're better off saying, I never thought about it. And then they're going to go, you never thought about it, and you want to be all right. So maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, but it probably is better. So your past is part what you make it. And of course, if there's some damning things or some bad things out there, there are probably people who did some worse things who are elected to the very same position, if not a higher up position. Don't let your past control you. You can't. You shouldn't do that, I don't think. Getting money is difficult. They say friends and family are the first people to go to. I disagree with that. I think that the worst people to probably go to first are friends and family, in a sense. And hear me out here, because this is something that I think is a little controversial when I say it. I know people are like, huh? So here's my pitch to you. Here's what I have to say about that. If you can't go to what I call them professional donors, if you can't go to a guy that gives every candidate who runs for Congress in a district $5,000, and he's been doing that for 20 years, if you can't get that guy to give you $500, then I think you're dead already. I think you're done. I don't think that the $250 from Aunt Minnie is going to really do anything for you. I don't. He's not going to be impressed by that. So it's okay to have them in the wings, but there's a strategic time to go to Aunt Minnie and say, hey, Aunt Minnie, I just raised $40,000 to run for city council. I could use your support. I'm looking to send another couple hundred mail pieces out. That's a lot more pitch than, hey, Aunt Minnie, thinking to run for city council. What do you think? Yeah, it's going to be kind of tough, isn't it? Spending your money. I've seen people do this different ways. I think that the problem with putting too much of your money in, there's two problems. One, people don't think you need the help, and they don't want to give you money. Well, I'll see what he can do on his own. He's got the money. The second problem is that you don't get the support. Remember, a campaign is about going out in a war with your soldiers and taking the battlefield and winning, right? If you have no donors and you do it all yourself, well, who is the army? It's you? You're going on there on your own with everything? Maybe you can do that, but I've never seen it done. I've seen some people spend enormous amounts of money and lose. And I've seen people spend enormous amounts of money, run again and again, and finally win. But I'm not intimate enough with those campaigns to know whether or not they finally woke up and got some support. That's what I'm guessing happened. I know with Corzine in New Jersey, I think a long time ago, comes to mind. That's the problem, spending your own money. Be careful how you spend your own. Again, like friends and family, the spending your own money should come strategically. And we'll get into that when we start talking about the actual fundraising thing that I will get into. Getting money, we'll talk about that later in another episode. You have to figure out what it costs to run for the position you're running for, or to win, I guess I should say. Best way to do that is to look at the people who won and look and see how much they raised, right? It makes sense. Here's the problem with that. There are variables to that. So there's a guy who grew up in town, and he was a mayor, and he became a state rep, and he became a state senator, and so this guy's going to have more support and he's a chairman of a taxation committee or something. He's going to have more money than anybody else. You've got to do kind of I don't know the word for it. I guess just sort of look at all the people. Look at the last challenger who won and see how much money they raised, if it's in the last 5-10 years. And there hasn't been redistricting. Again, we'll talk about that later on. But that, even if there has been redistricting, that's a pretty good measure. It used to be about $100,000 to get you a seat at the table to run for Congress as a challenger. If you can get past the primary at $100,000, you got a good chance. I don't know how valid that is as far as a figure, and that's going to vary state to state, I think, a little bit, but not as much as you might think. But determining what it costs to win a campaign is very important to do. You've got to know how many votes, how much money, You got to know these things. Again, another podcast. We'll talk about that. The cost of what you are doing. Mailings, events, ads, signs, flyers, little palm cards, whatever they're calling them now. Push cards, I've heard them called. If I keep talking, you're going to figure out what state I was raised in because of the things I say. So I'm going to stop that. But you get the idea. You have to figure out, here's what not to do. How about that? Don't go and say, well, I'm going to put $500 in and I'm going to take an ad out in the local newspaper right there on page 12. And how many people are going to read that? You're probably going to get a couple hundred people who read that, all of whom have already made up their mind who they're going to vote for. And they're not impressed with your picture, and they don't care that you are a fighter. They don't even know what that means. I'm not trying to dismantle the campaign that doesn't exist for you before it exists for you. But what I'm trying to say is, have a plan. Have a strategy. Figure out what it's going to take to win, and then execute. So try to figure out, don't throw money at things and events. Try to figure out at the end, this is what they always teach you, start on election day and go backwards. You should be spending, in my opinion, probably about 90% of your money in the last week. They used to say this, last 2 weeks, last week, the last weekend, the last day, and election day. Those are the most important places in a campaign because people don't really pay attention until the last 2 weeks. And another problem with people, with strategy and with message and all these things that you need to figure out. We go over the sign stuff. I was going to do that next one. You need to realize that you're going to say the same thing for six months, 12 months. You're going to say the same thing, the same thing, the same thing, the same thing, the same thing. And you're going to be really tempted about 3 weeks before Election Day to change it up because you're sick of saying the same thing. But the problem is you've been saying it to probably the same people. And you yourself are the audience you're thinking of. You can say things for 11 months, and the right people they weren't even listening. And now they're starting to listen. They're just starting to listen. It's October, late October, and now you've changed your message from something that got you to late October into something else that's untested, and people don't want to hear it, or they don't like it, or they're confused about who it is you are. A campaign is like a picture. It's like you've got to figure, what am I painting here? A portrait. You start painting a boat, and then at the top of the boat, instead of sails, you have dog faces there. Well, that's not going to really, well, some people, maybe that'll work. But unless you're on, yeah. You've got to know where you're headed, and you've got to be as objective as possible. You've got to have the right people. You've got to have the right team. As far as working with professionals, this is another thing that is very important to think about. Most professionals in this business, I think, are complete crooks. They'll take your money, they will take the credit for you winning, and they will tell you things that I'm going to tell you in the series of 4 or 5 podcasts, if you're lucky to hear this stuff. And that's all they do. If you're polling really well, for some reason, you probably don't need them. And if you aren't polling pretty well, then they're not going to care about you. They're going to bill you. There are different ways to do that. I won't get into it. But there are no free rides in life, in political campaigns, raising money, campaigning. You've got to do this yourself. You've got to do this yourself. I remember when I joined the Army, I was scared. I was 23 or something. I was more scared of basic training than I was, because I knew I had to do this myself. I had to stand there and get yelled at and go running around and do all this stuff and deal with waking up at 5 in the morning, whatever it was, 5 in the morning, going to bed at 11 o'clock at night or midnight or whatever it was. I had to do all these things, and I think it's very similar. You got to just make it happen. No one else is going to be able to do that for you. And here is the key to all this. And then I'll give a couple of tips before I get out of here for the next one. The key to all of it is you need to know as the candidate, everything revolves around you. You need to make everything happen. But you cannot, under any circumstance, run your campaign. You can't do it. You will lose. Do not micromanage your campaign. Do not think that you know better than others. I'm telling you right now, when you're a candidate, you just don't see things the way they are. You're so consumed with confusion and question. And is this the right thing to do? I don't know if this is the right thing. I don't want to do that. I'm a little nervous that it's not the right thing to do. I don't want to upset that guy. That guy got upset. That one voter who's never going to vote for you. You upset. Well, guess what? Who cares? The problem is that too many people get into this business. Once they start getting attention running for office, people start to recognize who they are. They just get so excited that people know, that guy knew who I was in that point. Wow, look at that. Everybody knew who I was. The thing that makes business people, so bad at winning elections, and if you look at it, I think they are pretty bad at it. If you take the fact that they're the ones who have money, and then the percentage who are business owners versus percentage who are not, I'll bet you more non-business owners win. But I don't want to go down that right now. We'll do that sometime together. But the reason why I think business people are so bad at political campaigns, and think about this, is because as a business, if you go out and you're selling soft drinks and you get 12% of the people to buy your soft drinks, you are an amazing success. You are amazing success with a lot of money. 12% market share. If you got a 12% market share at the polls, you get 12% at the polls. You're a failure. You may have not run at all. There's no style points. They don't curve the grade. You got to set out to get 50% of the vote plus one. You've got to convince people. You've got to convince people not only that you're qualified. That's step one. I'm qualified to do this job. Well, congratulations. So's the guy who's in there now. They're not going to tell you that, but they're thinking that. And what does that mean? You've got to convince them to fire that guy. And you know what it's like? It's like going up to me or you in your car and saying, hey, this car is so bad, you've got to get rid of this car and buy one of these cars on this lot over here, and convincing you to do it. Now, how hard would that be for you right now? For someone to approach you in the street with the 10 seconds while you're at a stoplight and convince you to get rid of your car right now and to buy a car that the guy is pointing at off in a car lot next to the stoplight. That is pretty similar to what politics is. You're meeting a voter, you got about 10 seconds, and you've got to compel that voter who probably doesn't even know who the person is you're running against and say, hey, he's doing such a bad job, you got to get me in there. Here's why. Well, why do I need to do that? They always say don't educate the voter. That's so important. Don't educate the voter. Give them a compelling reason. Give them controversy of some kind. That doesn't mean go running around and saying something stupid so you're in the newspaper. That means you've got to create some kind of controversy. Here's why we cannot have this guy in office. Here's why I've got to get in there. Here's what this guy in there now is doing that's so bad that you got to put me in there. Well, what's he doing so bad? The guy in there now is going to raise your taxes by 20%, and I am going to make sure your taxes never go up. There you go. There's a reason. I'm not saying it's a good one. I'm just saying there's a reason. If you don't want your taxes to go from, $700 a month to $900, property taxes. Guy in there now just said he was going to double the property taxes. There's a compelling reason. You've got to find whatever it is. Controversy. That's controversy, by the way. It doesn't mean spitting on someone or doing something dumb. It means letting someone know that you need to be elected. You've got to get that across. It's got to be on everything you do. your mailings, your radio ads, your TV ads, your shaking hands, your speechifying, as they said in the old movies. Whatever it is you do, every contact you make has got to have that. And if it's so obvious that someone needs to be some kind of a change, you still have to have a message, a reason to vote for you. It's not just, I'm qualified, he's qualified, they're qualified, you're qualified, hey, your son over there is qualified. Sure, we're all qualified, I guess. We're all over 25 years old and citizens. You've got to give people a reason, a controversy. All right. Best first step. Here's what I'd say the best first step is if you're thinking about doing this. Other than, I'll say 2 things to do. The first 2 things to do. How about 3 things? The first thing to do is polling. The second thing to do is learning about specific things. The third thing to do is to subscribe to this podcast. You can also email me at renegadepoliticspodcast@gmail.com. renegadepoliticspodcast.com is the website. Polling is very simple to do. I first learned this simple method, I know 2001. I think earlier. There used to be those old computers, those big computers, and they have the modem in there, and it would go, and it would call, and you'd connect. There would be a card that would do phone polling, and all you did, I remember I predicted a state rep race at something like 7,000 voters, and I want to say I got about 50 respondents, 50 people, 50, responded. And because it was completely random, and I just took a voter list, and I just phone called those 50 people, I came within like 2 points or something of predicting that campaign. It is amazing. It really is amazing. And if you don't believe me, poll yourself. And that should be the first step. You to poll yourself. If you think people know you, poll yourself. I've been the chairman of the local kayak club for 20 years. Everybody knows who I am. Oh, yeah, go ahead and poll yourself. If you dare. Yeah, no one's going to know who you are. Poll yourself regularly. That you can do it on some of these things. Fire something. I don't know. These automated phone. That should be like 3 to 5 cents a call, I think. Poll yourself. Poll how your opponent is doing. Poll the weaknesses in your opponent. I'll do a podcast on this. But at least the first thing you do is poll yourself. If you think you have some standing in the community, poll yourself. Or at least, how do you feel about Representative Jim Jones? Press 1, you like him. Press 2, you don't like him. A bunch of people don't like him. There you go. There's an in. There's something there. People can be persuaded. The second thing, you need to learn about some of the laws. Printing campaign. You've got to have a campaign account. You've got to be legal. You probably either have a state finance authority or a federal one. There's a state, federal, and maybe a city, depending on where you are. Usually just a state and a federal one. You've got to be legal with that stuff. You don't need a lawyer to do this. Just read it. There's usually a campaign handout. Read that. It's important. Read it. You're going to need signatures maybe. Read this stuff. Learn the history. Look. Read. Look and see. Make a whatever you do. Figure out the position you want to run for and see if it makes sense. See if you match up well for it. Those are really the 2 things. Of course, listen to this podcast, but poll yourself, poll your opponent, and read up on the first steps to just get yourself on the ballot. Those are the things you should do. Running a campaign, I know this sounds discouraging, and it's supposed to be, but it's not supposed to discourage you to the point where you don't want to do it. It's supposed to get you to realize what you're getting yourself into. There's a lot to it, and I'm going to try to do, like I said, maybe 5 or 6 podcasts, just sort of covering the basics, and then go into other things. I'd appreciate your feedback if you have any. renegadepoliticspodcast@gmail.com. I will not be upset. Anything you say, don't care. Don't use my name. Nobody cares who I am anyway. Hey, that's another thing you have to realize. People aren't going to care what your name is. You got to make them care what your name is. But it can be a very rewarding thing to do. And some people say don't run unless you're committed to running 3 times. And that sounds horrible, but there's some truth to that. You never know. You could win, but It's a path. It's a journey. It's something you have to want to do and care very deeply in. Something. Just care deeply in something, will you? Other than your own personal profit. That's all I ask. RenegadePoliticsPodcast.com